Good afternoon. As you're figuring out, yes, Chris Kyle was an incredible SEAL. Brave, smart, tough, and yes, he was a gifted sniper. Calm, cool, patient, and precise. But Chris was much more than a patriotic serviceman, much more than a talented marksman, much more than an outstanding SEAL, and much, much more than just a person. He was a man, he was a myth, and he was a legend. Let me tell you about the man. Talking to a young SEAL last night that had worked with Chris in Ramadi in 2006, a hail of bullets ripped through the building they were occupying as they provided overwatch for coalition forces. Due to the barrage of gunfire, this young SEAL dropped to the ground and hid behind a wall. When he finally got the courage to look back up, he saw Chris, who hadn't come off his gun, who hadn't taken cover, but instead stayed glued to his weapon, covering his field of fire, and was calling out enemy positions as he began to engage them. In the push through Fallujah in 2004, Chris had been sent to provide sniper protection to Marines from a safe distance as the city was cleared of ruthless and violent insurgents. But Chris believed he could be more effective if he was closer to the Marines he was supporting. So he joined them in the streets, moving house to house, door to door, alongside them, ensuring that they were safe. During that push, he even ran through a hail of enemy bullets to rescue one Marine that had been separated from his unit. During his last deployment to Iraq in 2008, he was called on once again to use his God-given talent as a sniper to protect U.S. Army units as they fought for control of the savage neighborhood of Sadr City. Once again, his lethal skill was critical in saving the lives of coalition forces as they fought against a determined enemy. For countless acts of heroism and bravery like these, Chris received numerous awards, all for valor, including multiple Bronze Stars and Silver Stars. But these acts and these awards and these events are not what made Chris Kyle. Now let me tell you about the myth. There's a myth that a sniper is always orderly and neat and detailed. Now although Chris's weapons were always clean, his personal space was definitely not. When Chris went home from deployment in 2006, his room was in such a devastated state of filth, it took days to clean, including picking up 6 months worth of sunflower seed shells that had been spit on the ground around his bed. There's a myth of dedication to the job. Well, the reality is that there was no Navy SEAL who had ever been more dedicated to video games than Chris Kyle. After being in the field for days, conducting exhausting operations, where every other SEAL would be heading to bed to get some well-deserved sleep, Chris would fire up his Alienware computer for a marathon session of John Madden NFL football, play that video game and relive his childhood Texas football glory. There's also the myth of rigid discipline. And now, while Chris was certainly a force on the battlefield, he was seldom in anything resembling a military uniform. He painted Punisher skulls on his gear, cut the sleeves off his shirts, wore civilian hunting shoes in place of combat boots, and instead of the ballistic protection of a Kevlar helmet, he preferred to sport a faded University of Texas Longhorn ball cap, just to make sure the enemy knew Texas was being represented and that Texans shot straight. There's a myth that SEALs are waterborne frogman commandos. And while we know Chris was extremely comfortable in urban combat, on long patrols in the desert, to be honest with you, he didn't like the water at all. He didn't want to scuba dive or even swim in the cold Pacific Ocean. And every time there was training in the water, Chris mysteriously had other business to attend to, or an injured knee, or a perforated eardrum, or a sinus infection, or any and all imaginable medical complications that would prevent that good old Texas country boy from getting in the ocean at all. There's also a myth that the warrior is always serious and constantly on edge. There could be nothing further from the truth with Chris. His cackling laughter was a constant sound during training and even during combat. His pranks were always hilarious, unless of course you were the unfortunate victim, in which case you could either laugh or, as you've heard today, get choked out. And finally, there's this myth about this nickname, the Legend, which, to be frank with you, started out as a joke. Chris had left his platoon, who was in the Pacific Theater, to go and augment other SEALs that were in Iraq that were getting ready to push through Fallujah. And when stories of Chris's heroism and success in combat started to circulate back to his teammates, they began to sarcastically and mockingly refer to Chris as the Legend. But I think, as we gather here today, it's very clear that that myth became a reality. But what made Chris legendary was not his skill as a SEAL, or as a sniper, or his sense of humor, or his valorous acts on the battlefield. What made Chris a legend was his heart. It was his heart that made him care so much for his teammates. He would do anything for his brothers in arms, and he was crushed when they were lost. I remember when Mark Lee, from Chris's Charlie platoon, who was the first SEAL killed in Iraq, died in a vicious gunfight. Many of the SEALs from our troop prepared something to say at the memorial service in Ramadi.